Hey guys, thank you so much for joining us today. Please send a comment, let us know where you're joining from. We want to see where you are and we want to make sure people are out there. But thank you so much. I'm holding true to my promise to keep it real. I said on the very first broadcast that I didn't want to interview a bunch of like experts and historians, and those are wonderful people, DEI, thought leaders, but I wanted this to be different. I wanted to bring you inside. I wanted to show you real conversations, real talk, real discussion that, to be frank, oftentimes white people don't have access to. And I think that that's part of the chasm. I think that's one of the things that separates us, is that we do tend to live. Oh, hi from Paris. Oh my gosh. You know what? I'm not even going to go off on that. I'm about to turn 50. I was supposed to be in Paris, but COVID had other plans. But thank you for joining us from Paris. But today I have my husband. So Sean is here. Hello, Sean.
Hello, Dana.
Say hi to everybody.
Hello, everyone.
And so he's going to join me today because what I want to talk about today, this is going to be a difficult conversation, but I think it's going to be a really, really important conversation. This is something you're not going to hear anywhere else. You're not going to hear this in a training class. You're not going to hear this at your job, and you shouldn't, to be quite honest. But I think it's important, and I'm willing to have this conversation because I think it's a part of moving forward. So before we really get into the conversation, I just want to do a little bit of a caveat. First, I want to talk about what it's not. Today, we're going to talk about family stories and trauma. We're going to talk about some generational trauma as it relates to race. And I think it's such an important conversation to have. But this is not about shaming anyone. This is not about making people feel guilty. That is not what this is about. It's not about engendering pity. I promise you, Sean and I have an amazing life. So it's not about anybody feeling sorry for us. But and London's here. Welcome from London. It's really about just getting real. That's what my entire show is about. It's about bringing you in, just letting you see not just our lives and how race has impacted our lives, but our parents, our grandparents, what this generational trauma really is and what it looks like. And so I'm doing this today for three primary reasons. First, it is so hard to have a really productive conversation with people, white people, who have a very different experience. And it's not their fault necessarily that you don't have the same experience I have. I mean, we're different. The history of this country is that white people and black people typically have had very different experiences. But I think that what happens in the workplace, it's almost like we're thrown together and we're expected to work on these issues together, hand in hand. But the reality is we have such different perspectives. I mean, imagine if you and I were tasked on working on a serious chronic condition like MS or rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or something like that. And I'd read a couple articles about it, but you've lived with the condition for 20 years. Can you imagine how we would approach it differently? And so there's no way I'm even going to be able to come close to understanding your perspective until and unless you start to reveal a lot more of that to me. So that's really ultimately my goal, is to get us to the place where we can start to understand each other's perspective a little bit more. Next thing I want to do is I want to dispel this myth. And I'm going to be honest, it infuriates me. Sean and I were watching Bill Maher a couple of Fridays ago, and he infuriates me weekly. We used to go see him. I used to respect him a ton. But they keep putting out misinformation. They keep having people on who clearly are not thought leaders or experts in this area. Usually he brings some other white man who knows less about the topic than he does. And then they play a game of ideological hacky sack with anti-racism. But that aside, that's probably a discussion for another day. When conversations come up around reparations, for example, they always want to act like discrimination happened 5 bajillion years ago. Oh, we could never pay reparations because those people have been dead for 15 generations. No, legalized discrimination based on race is very recent in this country. We need to remember that, okay? And for Black people, guess what? We don't need a reminder because it's in our family. Okay, when we talk about reparations, we talk about trying to repair the situation. We don't have to go back 12 generations. Let's do a little history lesson. Brown versus Board of Education was 54, but of course, there was virtually no desegregation until the protests in 64. 64 was the Civil Rights Act that LBJ signed, and that created equity and accommodations, employment, etc. Voting Rights Act 65, we know what they're trying to do today relative to voting, but that's a whole nother conversation. Supreme Court in 67 ruled in Loving versus Virginia that the state's bans on interracial marriage were unconstitutional. Oh, and by the way, guess what? States didn't automatically say, oh, okay, that's wrong. We're going to take it off of our state constitution. They waited, they resisted. The last state to take off bans against interracial marriage off their books was Alabama. Guess what year it was? Okay, it wasn't 15 generations ago. It wasn't 300 years ago. It was the year 2000. Okay, it was the year 2000. So doesn't mean that it was illegal in Alabama. They knew it was not enforceable. They knew it was illegal, but they kept it on their books anyway. And by the way, when they had that vote, 40% of the legislature who voted against it, voted against removing it. And then 68, of course, when we're talking about how recent these things are, Fair Housing Act was in 68. So there was legalized racial discrimination in this country until at least 1968. Okay, so when we talk about compensation, we talk about trying to make some level of repair. We don't have to go back 15 generations. We don't have to go back 3,000 years. My parents are alive today. Okay, they experience housing discrimination. They are alive today. Anybody that you work with who's a Black person, who was alive before 1964, they were born into a country where there was legalized Jim Crow, legalized discrimination. And if they grew up in the South, they more than likely experienced it firsthand. So how dare we try to act like there's no way that, first of all, that there was no harm done. I mean, can you imagine if your children grew up in conditions where they were told they were inferior and they couldn't attend a school, they couldn't drink out of a water fountain, they couldn't go to a pool because they were inferior? Can you imagine how livid you would be if they grew up in those conditions? So I know I'm getting on my high horse a little bit there, but let me just quickly say the third reason why we're talking about this. So again, we want to dispel this myth that this is like 5,000 years ago and these people have been dead for 200 years. No, this is our current family. Okay. Interestingly enough, Sean and I did a pre-call and we talked about a whole bunch of stuff that we wanted to share with you guys today. And then when we're getting dressed this morning, he says to me, oh, do you want me to mention that a guy who went to my high school got lynched when I lived in Mississippi? I'm like, what? Like, how did you forget that? Okay. So I'm sorry, not Mississippi, Mobile, Alabama, right, Sean?
Right.
Mobile, Alabama.
Mobile,
yeah, okay.
Alabama.
But he literally was like, oh yeah, I forgot to mention that. Okay, somebody from my high school got lynched. So yes, this is not like centuries ago. And then thirdly, this generational trauma, whether we realize it or we don't realize it, changes how we interact with white people oftentimes. Okay, not all the time, not every day, but whether we realize it or not, for many Black people, there is that undercurrent of fear. I can promise you, I can talk about my own family. Doesn't mean that we don't go out and do what we need to do, or we're not, candid or pushing back. But oftentimes, we're not giving white people the 100% truth, or we're not being as forthright as we could be, because there is that underlying fear through those generations of angering white people for very good reason. I'm not speaking for everyone. I can't speak for everyone. Sean can't speak for everyone. But certainly, I think that it's very valid to say that there are many, many Black people who suffer from that generational trauma, again, whether they acknowledge it or not, and it changes how they interact with white people. You know, just my opinion, we're not psychologists, we are not psychiatrists. Sean actually is a physician, he is an MD, but this is not his area. But if you want to read more about that, I didn't even know about this book until I decided to do this show, and people on social media started telling me about it. But it's called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy Degree. So if you want to learn more about that, please look into that book. It's great. So Claudia just said, yeah, we can't be authentic, again. And this is what people won't say. This is what nobody wants to talk about. The George Floyd trial, the Derek Chauvin trial is going on right now. And there are going to be many, many conversations in workplaces. And I can almost guarantee you, Black people are not probably going to be as candid or as forthright, because we've been conditioned to not be as candid and forthright, and to only be as honest with white people as we feel they can handle, or as we feel there won't be significant retribution. So at any rate, again, thank you guys. Please send in your comments. I want to acknowledge you. Let's get right into it. So with that, I want to talk chronologically today. So we're going to go back and we're going to start with, say, our grandparents, and then we're just going to move chronologically. And I just want to give you a sense of what is real for us, the racial stories that have been passed down or what we've personally experienced. But I just want to give you an inkling into, for an average Black person, what we've experienced and how race has really impacted our life. So with that, Sean, let me turn it over to you. I want to start with the grandparents. Let's start with beloved Grandma Robbie. So let's start with Grandma Robbie, how she came into the world and some experiences that she had.
My Grandma Robbie is my paternal grandmother, and she was biracial. Because actually, interesting, her mother is biracial and her father was white. And the story is that her mother, who was biracial, was raped by a white man of standing in the community when she was 16, and the product was my Grandma Robbie.
Okay. And I know that's not a fun topic, but we need to be honest about it. And that's something that's not talked about, since Sean has that on both sides of his family. Because let's talk about Grandpa Jess for a second. How did Grandpa Jess come into the world?
So Grandpa Jess is my maternal grandfather. And the story is his mother worked at a shop in a small town in Arkansas. I believe it was Watson, Arkansas. And she worked for a white shop owner. And the story in the family is that, of course, he raped her, and he's the product of their union.
Okay. So again, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a therapist, but I don't think it takes one to know that rape is an extremely traumatic experience. It's well known that white slave owners raped Black women regularly. There's not a ton of information out there. I did pull this article. I tried to put the URL in the comments, but apparently I don't think I can comment to all the destinations. But if you're interested, it's from AmericanBar.org. The title of the article is The Intersection of Race and Rape Viewed Through the Prism of a Modern Day Emmett Till. And I don't want to spend too much time there, but I always want to bring you guys facts. I want this to be factual. We have to, look at the truth, be honest with the truth before we can move forward and really address a problem. But what this does is it talks about the history of rape throughout this country, looking at different phases, different historical phases. So of course, during chattel slavery, it says white slave owners freely and legally raped the women whom they enslaved, often in front of their families. They used rape to assert their power and authority over their property without accountability. The offspring of enslaved women were then also considered their master's property, giving these men more economic power and further stripping African American women of the rights to their own bodies and babies. The legal system enforced this by the sin of omission. No Louisiana law made the rape of a Black woman, slave or free, a crime. Rape was specifically limited to white women under the state's law. However, Louisiana's provisions mandated a capital punishment for both the rape and the attempted rape of a white female by a slave. And I'm not going to go into all the detail. It talks about the father of modern gynecology. If you don't know that story, James Marion Sims, but basically he used slave women to practice his gynecological practices, procedures without any anesthesia. So he operated on them without any anesthesia, multiple times, to perfect his techniques. And then, of course, during Jim Crow, it says during the Jim Crow era, white men used rape and rumors of rape not only to justify violence against African American men, but also to remind African American women that their bodies were not their own. Here, once again, white men in positions of power over African American women, such as police officers and employers, use sexual assault and rape to dominate them. All right. So I'm not going to go on too much more, but if you're interested, please read into that. But again, this is just one example. When you are the product of rape, how does that not just traumatize you, but traumatize your bloodline? They can change the laws, but when you look in the mirror, you're still reminded of that horror. So that horror follows us. And I don't think that Sean is that unique in that regard. He happens to have that story on both sides of his family. And then, Sean, just tell us a little bit more about Grandma Robbie in terms of her experience with employment.
So my grandma Robbie, as you might expect, because her father was white and her mom was biracial, she was very fair. She appeared Caucasian to most people. And when she did migrate to the North in the 50s to Chicago, and she was able to, work and find a job there. Interesting. I don't think we spoke about this, Dana. Interesting. Her first cousins also moved north too, and none of them were educated. Actually, the three of them, none of them were educated. Her two first cousins found jobs as domestics in the Chicago suburbs, and my grandmother was able to gain employment in a factory. And she worked at a couple of different factories. She worked at one prior to my untimely death of my grandfather, and then she also, after taking care of him and going back to work, she worked at another factory, and she noticed that there were no, at that time, colored people around. And so she was saying, hey, why are there no colored people at this factory? And her coworkers told her that, oh, we don't hire coloreds. And so at that point, she decided to quit.
And that says so much about her, because she didn't have to quit. And Lord knows she probably needed that money. Tell us what Grandma Robbie's, because Grandma Robbie knew her father, correct? Her white father.
Yeah. So Grandma Robbie was from rural Mississippi, from Senatobia, Mississippi, in Tate County, and her father, she knew who her father was, but of course he never claimed her and he never supported her. And he was from a well-to-do family or a family that was known to have money. So when she turned 16 or so, her family had a hard time financially growing up. Of course, she was born in 1917, so she grew up during the before and during the Depression. And so at this time period, when she turned about 16, she went to her father, who, like I said, had standing in community. He was well known, and she said, "Hey, listen, why didn't you ever help us out? We needed your help. We had a really tough time." And his response to her was that, you Black women know what you need to do if you want to earn money.
Right. Can you imagine that? I mean, I can't even imagine that. And I asked you, I said, what, now I know that this was not discussed that much in the family, but what were Grandma Robbie's views about white people from what you understand?
Well, my Grandma Robbie, of course, in my estimation, is the closest thing to a saint as there could be. But one of the things she always said was that I'm not prejudiced. She was always saying, I'm not prejudiced. She's not prejudiced. She always was a forgiving person. and she wasn't prejudiced. She didn't show a preference toward any race.
And I think that's a fallacy. I think that a lot, and again, I can't speak for white people. So white people, please put, comment, let me know. But I think that oftentimes there's this assumption that because we were so brutalized, because our ancestors were treated so horribly and so inhumanely, and it was so egregious, the violence, the brutality, that we just must hate white people. We wake up every day, we just hate white people. That's one of the reasons why they don't want us to have guns, and we just hate white people. And that's not the truth. I mean, I think that Black people are such loving people. I mean, obviously we're not monolithic. Obviously we're all individuals. We have our individual experiences and our individual thoughts, but I have a very similar experience as well. When I think about the psychological impact in my family, it was just more so fear. It wasn't even anger as much as fear for the terror that they went through. I think some of you have commented about, we're going to talk about the Great Migration. For those of you who have ancestors who, I shouldn't say ancestors because that makes it sound like it was 100 years ago, but parents, grandparents who participated in the Great Migration, let us know in the comments, because I want to put those comments up. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but I want to go back over to Grandpa Jess for a second. Did he have any relationship with his father? Did he have any communication with his father, to your knowledge?
So no, the short answer would be no. He had no communication. He grew up in a very small town, and because he was very fair, also everyone knew, and he carried his father's last name. Everyone knew that he was the son of the white shopkeeper or the white store owner.
Who was Latvian or Russian?
Who turns out happened to be from Russia. He was a Russian immigrant to the United States, and he was able to travel to the South and open up a store and be a successful merchant. But yeah, everyone knew who he was. So basically, from his estimate, the way it was told to me is that kind of protected him. So he didn't get, when his dad was in town, people didn't bother him. They kind of left him alone. You know who that is? That's so and so. That's that shopkeeper's son. And so he never had any interaction, as far as he told me, with his father whatsoever. But it was known based on his last name and how he appeared, that who he was.
Okay, certainly. And and my family is very different. I guess my mother's father was either white or half white, but my understanding is that it was not an assault situation, that they actually had a relationship. And you actually might know more about that than I do, because Sean's the genealogist in the family. And do you remember, did it say they lived together?
So your maternal grandmother's father was very fair. He was either I think he was either half white or white. I think he was biracial.
Oh, okay.
And that's my recollection. I haven't looked at it in so long, but that's my recollection, that your grandmother's father was biracial.
Right. So I think that it was a different situation. So again, not all situations were the same, but one thing that really stuck out for me, and I said this when I had my parents on my LinkedIn Live, and if you're interested in hearing firsthand from people who did grow up during Jim Crow, watch that on my YouTube channel. It's there. And one thing I always remembered about my grandfather, and again, I didn't have to hear this from anybody. This was my grandfather, not 10 generations ago, not 15 generations ago, my grandfather. But whenever I talked to my grandfather and I would tell him about something that happened, he immediately completely changed demeanor. And then he would always ask me one question right away. And what was so interesting, I said that when I was interviewing my mom and my dad, and I had never said that to her before in my life. And when I said that, she interrupted me and she said, "I know what the question was." And I was like, "Really?" And she said, "Yeah, he asked you, were they white or colored?" And that was exactly the question. Because he would get that look of fear, of terror on his face. And the first thing he needed to know was it a white person or was it a colored person? But he was born, I think it was 1906. The highest rate, the year that had the most lynchings in this country was actually 1892. Okay, because obviously there was way more lynching after slavery, because then you didn't want to kill your own property. So lynching went crazy, in part because Southern whites were upset about the end of slavery. They wanted to terrorize Black people to keep them in line. So this was something that was done. Unfortunately, over 4,000 Black people were recorded to have been lynched. Certainly, there might have been many more from about 1877 to 1950. But he was born right around that height of lynching. And then, of course, we started the episode by saying that Sean actually attended a high school in Mobile, Alabama, where he knew someone who was lynched, someone a couple years older than him. But let's go to the Great Migration, because those of you who are working with Black people, invariably, you're working with people whose parents participated in the Great Migration. That's when 6 million Black people over about 6 decades, from about 1916 to 1970, fled the South. They were fleeing terror. They were being terrorized in the South. They were desperate for better living conditions for them and for their family. I was born in 71. So my parents left from South Carolina. So that was right at the very end, from South Carolina to New York. But there are many, many stories. If you have a story of that, go ahead and put it in the comments so I can put it up there. And Sean, let me just ask you to share tell them the story. And I don't remember, I think it was Grandpa Richard, about what happened with him and how he had to leave all of a sudden, because I think it relates to Jacqueline's point here. You might get disappeared.
So my paternal grandfather, Richard Brownlee, he was born in 1906, I believe it was, 05 or 06. And he was an entrepreneurial person. He ran businesses. He had a restaurant. He had I think he had a jitney service, my father used to say. He had a pool hall. He was a barber shop owner. Anyway, he migrated from Mississippi to Memphis, Tennessee in the 30s, and he was a homeowner and a business owner in late 40s, early 50s in Memphis, Tennessee. But he ran his business. I think it was a restaurant or something. But my understanding is he also had a pool hall, and there may have been some gambling activity occurring at the pool hall. And turns out that the powers that be felt like they wanted him to give them a piece of the action. They wanted a kickback for turning a blind eye to the gambling that they knew was going on in his business. And he refused. And when he refused, the word went out that he wasn't going to make it, that his life was in jeopardy, his life was in danger. So he literally, this is the story I've been told, he literally left that day and he went to Chicago, Illinois. So this is in 1950. So can
you imagine? And also, how young were his kids?
So at the time, he had a 13-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a newborn.
And he got up and left the same day.
Because the idea is that the police, or we don't know, the authorities were going to either do physical harm to him. It could have been even death. So he had to leave town. He didn't have a choice. He had to leave to save his life.
He claimed his house or his property over to somebody else.
So he owned his own home, but he was able to quit claim it over to one of his brothers, because he had multiple brothers. So he quit claimed it to his brothers and left his business and just went to Chicago.
Right. And again, Sean's just a random person. He's not special. Almost every Black person has these stories in their family. And if you want to learn more, please read Isabelle Wilkerson's brilliant work, The Warmth of Other Suns. It's not maybe the cheeriest, easiest read in the world, but it starts to really give you a sense of what life has been like for Black people and how this racial discussion is a very different discussion for us. It's not academic. These are our family members. And then there's the financial component. Talk about Grandpa Jess with the GI Bill, Sean.
So my grandpa Jess, again, that's my maternal grandfather. He's a veteran of World War II. He was a Marine. He fought in the South Pacific. And as being a veteran, he was promised the GI Bill. So as part of a benefit of his service to the U.S. military in World War II, as being a member of the Greatest Generation, they were promised the GI Bill. And actually, when he was from rural Arkansas, but after serving, after the war ended, he moved to Chicago also. He moved to Chicago, Illinois. And he was with the idea that he would become a homeowner, but he was unable to benefit from the GI Bill because of redlining in Chicago. So the locality, he was unable to ever get a home through the GI Bill.
Right. So I should have gotten my books ready. Another book I want to highlight is When Affirmative Action Was White. And I'm not seeing it right now. It's there somewhere. And I'm blanking on the author. It's Ira someone. But When Affirmative Action Was White. In fact, if someone could put it in the comments, I'd appreciate that. But it does a great job of just going through how all of these social programs, all of these things that the government came up with, ironically, they came up with it to benefit white people. It was affirmative action for white people. And so traditionally what would happen is the Southern Democrats would put so much pressure on whoever was in the presidency that they would write the law to accommodate Jim Crow. And so the GI Bill was a perfect example. So even though federally Black veterans were supposed to be able to get the GI Bill, very, very few ever actually got it, because what they did was they turned over local control to those local municipalities. And so when they tried to either get benefits for school or they tried to get money to buy a house, they would go to their local bank and their local bank would say no. So someone put down Ira Katz Nelson, thank you so much. So please read his book. In fact, let me just expound on the GI Bill. 8 of 10 men born in the 1920s benefited from the GI Bill. The GI Bill literally created the middle class in America. If you're white, ask your grandparents, ask your parents about did they benefit from the GI Bill and what difference did that make in their family line? Because one of the things that we often forget is that this discrimination and racism wasn't just to be brutal. They weren't being brutal just to be brutal. It was about money. It was about getting wealthy on the backs of other people. So when all those white slave owners became wealthy, and then they changed the laws to abolish slavery, but of course there was a loophole that said except for punishment for a crime, which meant that they for decades continued to re-enslave Black people. But when they changed that law, they didn't take the money. That's money that was passed down for generations, which is why it's always so curious to me that whenever the subject of reparations comes up, the first thing out of most people's mouth is, oh, well, we can never give money. Well, that's what slavery was about. It was about money. It didn't even just enrich individuals, but states. If you look at the amount of money certain states got from convict leasing, I mean, it supported many state governments. So it was all about money. So the GI Bill, the Social Security Act, what they did was they excluded domestic workers and farm workers intentionally so that Black people would not have access to those benefits. So the GI Bill was just one example. So with that, I know that we're almost out of time. Again, it goes so fast. Tell me, let's talk a little bit, let's make it a little bit more current. I will actually share, I was thinking about the first time somebody called me the N-word. And we were moving into a new subdivision. And again, I was born in 71. This was, I guess, maybe in the 80s or so. I'm trying to do the math in my head. But I was probably in middle school, middle school-ish, I think. And we were going to be the first Black family in that subdivision. Well, we didn't just move in. That's just not the way it worked. They had to have a meeting with the HOA to find out. Maybe legally we were okay to move in. But again, this is the problem. People look at the law and they say, oh, well, that was outlawed back in. Okay, well, hearts and minds don't necessarily change just because a law was written. So what my parents' concern was, they were like, we want to be sure that our children are going to be safe. We want to be sure that we're not going to have crosses being burned on our front yard. So I remember this as a child. I very well remember this, that they had to have a meeting. And imagine explaining that to your kids. Imagine explaining to your kids that you want to buy this house, but you're not sure if you can buy it. They have to have a meeting first to decide if they're going to allow you to buy it, or even if they allow you to buy it, if there's going to be violence, if you're going to be safe being in that neighborhood. Imagine that. Think about what kind of trauma that might cause for you and your family. So eventually they did decide to let us move into the house, but they warned us. They said some of the most racist people in the subdivision live like right across the street from you, as luck would have it. And we actually ended up having like a little dog that got hit by a car. The dog got hit by the car in the cul-de-sac. They never said anything. They never did anything. Dog died. So we had no interaction with them. But then one day we were playing ball in the backyard. And so our backyard backed up to another person's house. And I don't know if it went in their yard. I don't remember exactly what happened, but somehow they ended up giving us the ball. And when they gave us the ball, they said to us, they said, well, are you guys the N-words? And we said, what? I said, I don't know. And so we went inside and asked our parents. We were like, are we N-words? Because we hadn't really heard that word before. So that for me was the first time that I remember experiencing that. So I know we're running out of time. Sean, why don't you talk about your experience in high school with the lynching?
Yes, ma'am. Although I'm from Chicago, my dad took a job in Alabama in the early 80s. And when I was a freshman in high school, I was in 1981. It turns out that one of the young men who had graduated from the same high school that I was attending was found lynched, and it made all the newspapers and all the local networks.
Right. And I
So it's in
know
1981 in Mobile, Alabama.
19, and then what did you find? He just actually texted the family member who's in law enforcement, who worked on that case. And so he sent us a Wikipedia link to it. If you guys want to go to it, it's called Lynching of Michael Donnell. And then what did you find out when you read through that about?
Oh, so it turns out that the KKK the Ku Klux Klan had a convention in Mobile, Alabama that weekend or that week. And after the convention, three or four of the members were driving around downtown Mobile, and they said, let's lynch an N-word. Let's go ahead and lynch a Black person. And sure enough, there was a guy walking down the street, and they pulled over and said, just ask him for directions. And they snatched him and lynched him. That was the last time he was killed. He was found the next day. It made all the press.
Yeah, and Jacqueline, you're right. We looked it up today, and his mother sued the KKK and got a huge settlement, which bankrupted. That's why you have to keep fighting. I mean, you have to keep fighting. And again, Sean is right there in the kitchen. He's not dead. I mean, so, this mythology that there's no way we can try to acknowledge or repay people who experienced trauma or who were harmed financially, emotionally, psychologically, otherwise, as a result of legalized discrimination. That is mythology, to try to act like, again, that these people have been dead for 200 years. No. Virtually every Black person in their family has stories to tell. The trauma is real. I say, if nothing else, all Black people should have access to free therapy. I mean, if nothing else, because the trauma is real. So with that, I know it's been 40 minutes and I don't want to go too long. I really want to thank everybody who showed up today. I know it wasn't a super cheery conversation, but just like she talks about in Warmth of Other Suns, and if you haven't read it, it's a must read. It's so important. If you really want to get a sense of understanding what life was like for our parents, our grandparents, and to a lesser extent for us, it's such an important read. And so it's all about just trying to get to really understand each other better, trying to get beyond the surface, really get to understand each other so that we can truly move forward. Next time, I'm talking to one of my first managers who happens to be a white man. And we're going to have a really interesting, fun conversation. I say fun because I hadn't seen him in 20 years. And so it was so great seeing him and reminiscing. But we're going to reminisce about race in the workplace. And it's interesting to have that dialogue with a white male. I mean, obviously, he has a different perspective, but we had a great relationship then. We have a great relationship now. And we're going to unpack that. So I want to thank everybody. Thank you so much. And join us first and third Tuesdays. Next time, we are going to do it at a special time. So keep an eye out for that. We're not going to be at noon next time. I think it's going to be 2 o'clock. We're going to do 2 o'clock Eastern on, I think it's April 20th, the third Tuesday of this month. So thank you, Sean.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Talk to y'all later.